Summer of 1969, somewhere in Texas. Heat shimmered off asphalt, turned backstage caravans into ovens. A blues festival, maybe 5,000 people sprawled across a field, there to see the fastest guitar players in the world go head-to-head. Johnny Winter was 25 years old and already a Texas legend. Born albino, white hair down to his shoulders, pale skin that burned in minutes. But it was his playing that set him apart. Fast, impossibly fast. His fingers moved like they weren't bound by physics. He played Delta blues, Skip James and Robert Johnson, but electrified, amplified, accelerated into something ancient and dangerous. By 1969, guitar magazines called him the fastest blues guitarist alive. He just signed a massive record deal. He was the future, and he believed it. Jimi Hendrix was also on the bill. 3 albums had redefined what an electric guitar could do. Jimi was everywhere, on every radio and every magazine, the subject of every conversation about guitar. But Johnny didn't see Jimi as a peer. He saw him as a threat. Jimi was theatrical, psychedelic, played with his teeth, behind his back, set guitars on fire. Johnny saw that as showmanship, not musicianship. Flash instead of substance. Johnny was a purist. Blues was supposed to be raw, honest, unadorned. He'd spent his life perfecting his craft, studying the masters. And now this guy was getting all the attention for playing guitar with his teeth. The promoter had scheduled them back to back. Johnny first, then Jimi would close. But that morning, when Johnny saw the schedule, he walked straight to the promoter's trailer. "I'm not doing it," Johnny said. The promoter looked up. "Not doing what?" "Playing before Hendrix. Put me after him or on a different day. I'm not warming up the crowd for a showman." The promoter sighed. "Johnny, you're both headliners. The order doesn't matter. It matters to me." "Why?" Johnny didn't answer immediately. How could he explain? That he'd worked too hard to be overshadowed by someone who played guitar like a circus act. That he knew, with absolute certainty, that if he played before Jimi, everyone would forget his set the moment Jimi started doing his tricks. "He'll make me look slow," Johnny finally said. The words came out quieter than he'd intended, almost vulnerable. The promoter studied him. "You're Johnny Winter. You're the fastest guitar player I've ever seen. How's anyone going to make you look slow? You haven't seen Hendrix up close. Neither have you." Johnny had no response. It was true. He'd never seen Jimi play live. He'd heard the records, seen the photos, but he'd avoided the shows, told himself it was all marketing, all theater. "The schedule's set. You're on at 8, Hendrix at 9:30. You can play or you can go home, but I'm not changing it." Johnny stood there, jaw tight, then turned and walked out. He spent the afternoon in his caravan, practicing. Not preparing, because he didn't need to prepare. He knew every song, every solo, every note he was going to play. He practiced because it was the only thing that calmed him down. The guitar felt right, familiar, an extension of himself. As long as he was playing, he was in control. He ran through his fastest runs, his most technically demanding passages. His fingers moved across the fretboard in patterns he drilled into muscle memory over thousands of hours. This was his language, his truth. Speed was honesty to him. No room to hide behind effects or volume. Just pure technique, pure skill, pure dedication. Around 7 p.m., someone knocked. 15 minutes, Mr. Winter." Johnny nodded, grabbed his guitar, stepped into the oppressive heat. The sun was setting, but it hadn't cooled down. He could hear the crowd, a low rumble of anticipation. Backstage, he saw Jimi for the first time in person, sitting on an equipment case, fringed vest and bell-bottoms, Stratocaster across his lap, quietly noodling, not performing, just playing to himself. A couple of musicians stood nearby, watching, but Jimi seemed unaware. Johnny walked past without saying anything. He didn't want to talk. He just wanted to play, prove his point, get off that stage. The stage manager gave him the signal. Johnny walked out into the lights. The crowd roared. He plugged in, adjusted his amp, launched straight into "It's My Own Fault." His fingers flew. This was what he'd been born to do. Notes came out machine gun fast, perfectly clean, everyone articulated with precision. Skip James licks at double speed. Slide guitar runs most people couldn't play with fingers. He bent strings, hammered on, pulled off, made the guitar scream and cry. The crowd went wild. People standing, shouting, stomping. This was Texas blues at its finest, impossibly fast. Johnny felt validated. This was real guitar playing. Not tricks, not theatrics. Pure, undeniable skill. He played 45 minutes, each song harder and faster than the last. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. People on their feet, screaming his name. Johnny walked off feeling vindicated. Let Hendrix follow that. Backstage, he toweled off sweat, caught his breath. He'd played harder than usual, wanted to make sure there was no question about who was the better guitarist. The stage manager set up for Jimi's performance. More amps, more equipment. Johnny watched from the shadows, curious despite himself. Then Jimi walked on stage. No announcement, no fanfare. The crowd erupted again, maybe louder. Johnny felt a spike of resentment. Jimi strapped on his Stratocaster, adjusted his amp, started playing. The first thing Johnny noticed was the tone, different from anything he'd heard on records. Thicker, more dimensional, like Jimi had found extra frequencies that shouldn't exist. The second thing was the rhythm. It wasn't fast. It was moderate, relaxed, almost lazy. Nothing like the speed Johnny had just demonstrated. Jimi played the opening riff to Red House, a slow blues Johnny had played 1,000 times. Basic chord progression, nothing fancy. But the way Jimi played it, each note had weight, meaning an emotional dimension that made you lean in closer. Johnny, standing in the shadows, felt his stomach tighten. Jimi started singing, voice smooth and soulful, just telling a story. Then he hit the first guitar solo and everything changed. He wasn't playing fast. He was playing slow, deliberate, expressive. Every note sang. Every bend had purpose. Every pause felt intentional, meaningful, like watching someone paint, each brushstroke carefully placed. The crowd went completely silent, hypnotized. Nobody screaming, nobody stomping, just listening, absorbed, pulled into whatever world Jimi was creating. Johnny watched Jimi's hands. The technique was flawless, but that wasn't what made it remarkable. It was the choices, where Jimi chose to put notes, where he chose not to. The way he let a single note sustain for 8, 10, 12 seconds, bending it, vibrating it, making it evolve and change color while it hung in the air. The silence between phrases felt as important as the notes themselves. Jimi would play a line, then stop, let it resonate, let the audience absorb it before moving forward. It was conversational, like he was speaking directly to each person in the crowd, pausing to let them respond in their minds. Johnny had played hundreds of notes in the time Jimi played 20, but Jimi's 20 notes said more. Each one carried weight, intention, meaning. Johnny's hundreds had been impressive, technically astounding, but they'd been surface, sound without depth, motion without destination. The realization hit Johnny like a physical blow. Speed didn't matter. Technique didn't matter. What mattered was what you were saying, and Jimi was saying something profound while Johnny had just been showing off. Jimi moved through the song, never rushing, never forcing, just letting the music flow. He played some phrases behind his head, and instead of looking like a gimmick, it looked natural, like that's where his hands needed to be to get the right sound. The crowd responded differently than they'd responded to Johnny. This wasn't impressed applause. This was emotional response. People swaying, some with tears in their eyes, nodding like they understood something they couldn't articulate. Johnny felt something crack inside him. All those hours of practice, all that speed, all that technical perfection, and in 5 minutes Jimi had shown him it was beside the point. Jimi finished Red House and transitioned into another song, then another. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Sometimes barely playing at all, just letting the amp feedback create texture while he shaped it. Johnny watched the entire set. He couldn't leave, couldn't look away, even though every minute was painful. By the time Jimi finished, Johnny felt hollowed out. Jimi walked off to stage to massive applause, chanting, begging for more. He waved, smiled, headed backstage. Johnny stood there, guitar case in hand, not sure what to do. Part of him wanted to leave immediately. Part of him wanted to smash his guitar, quit music entirely. Jimi saw him and walked over. "Hey man, you played great earlier. That's speed, that's something else." Johnny couldn't respond. His throat felt tight. "You okay?" Jimmy asked, genuine concern. "How do you do that?" Johnny finally managed. "How do you make it sound like that?" Jimmy looked surprised. "I just play what I feel. Same as you, probably." "It's not the same," Johnny said. "I've been practicing my whole life to play fast. You just taught me that speed means nothing." Jimmy shook his head. "Speed means something if that's your truth. That's your style, your voice. Don't let me or anyone else make you doubt that. But you just—" Johnny stopped, not sure how to finish. "I just played slow blues," Jimmy said. "You played fast blues. We're both playing blues. Different approaches, same heart." There was a pause. Johnny looked at his hands, calloused from years of practice, scarred from broken strings and rough frets. "How do you know when to play and when not to play?" Jimmy smiled slightly. "I listen to the silence. The space between notes is where the meaning lives. Notes are just the frame. Speed can be beautiful, but so can stillness. Your speed is your gift. Don't abandon it. Just maybe ask yourself what you're racing toward." Johnny wanted to believe that. He'd spent his life believing faster was better, that technique was king, that mastery meant control, and Jimmy had just shown him that mastery might mean letting go. They talked a few more minutes, but Johnny couldn't hear what Jimmy was saying. His mind was too loud, too full of contradictory thoughts. Eventually, Jimmy excused himself, and Johnny was left alone in the darkness. He didn't leave right away. He sat on an equipment case, guitar beside him, listening to the crowd disperse, replaying Jimmy's performance, trying to understand what had happened. Years later, in a 1977 guitar player interview, Johnny told his story with humor and pain. The interviewer asked about his influences, and Johnny mentioned that Texas night. "I thought I was the best," Johnny said. "I could play faster than anyone, cleaner than anyone. Then I saw Jimi Hendrix play a slow blues, and I realized I'd been asking the wrong questions." "What do you mean?" "I'd been asking, how fast can I play?" Jimmy was asking, what do I need to say? Speed was my ego. Depth was his courage. I'd confuse virtuosity with artistry, technique with expression. They're connected, sure, but they're not the same thing. You can master the instrument without mastering yourself. Did that change how you played? Everything changed. I didn't try to be Jimmy, but I stopped trying to prove I was the fastest. Started trying to prove I had something to say. Started listening to the spaces between my notes. Started asking if each phrase served the song or just served my ego. That night in Texas broke something in me, but it also freed something. Do you regret that night? Johnny was quiet. No, it humbled me. Hurt like hell at the time. Made me question everything. But it freed me from something I didn't know was a prison. I'd built my identity around being the fastest, and Jimmy showed me that was the smallest version of what I could be. The most limited interpretation of my own potential. When Jimmy died in September 1970, Johnny was devastated. He'd only seen him a handful of times after that Texas festival, but Jimmy had changed him, shown him a different way to approach music, and losing that presence felt like losing a teacher he'd only just started to understand. At a show after Jimmy's death, Johnny dedicated his set to Jimmy's memory. He played slow blues, let the notes breathe, let silence be part of the music. The audience noticed something different that night. It wasn't about speed anymore. It was about meaning. Johnny Winter went on to have a remarkable career, recording dozens of albums, touring for decades, becoming recognized as one of the great blues guitarists of his generation. But he never forgot that Texas night when he'd refused to share the stage, only to learn that there was room for everyone, that different voices could coexist, that speed and depth weren't enemies but different expressions of the same truth. The lesson wasn't that slow was better than fast or depth better than technique. The lesson was that ego blinds you to possibilities, that being the best at one thing might mean missing the point entirely. Johnny Winter had been the fastest guitarist in Texas that night. Jimi Hendrix had been the deepest, and both had taught each other something neither could have learned alone.